So, of course, it is disturbing the number of African Americans that are killed by police. And, this is raising a conversation and a number of questions about what are the issues that need to be tackled within police departments? And one of the things that comes up has to do with hiring practices and diversity. So in a new CBS News poll, 57% of Americans actually believe that police treat white people better than blacks. And 78% of Black Americans polled agree. Jennifer Cobbina is an associate professor of criminal justice at Michigan State University and is with us to discuss whether recruiting more officers of color could be the key to reducing violence in Black communities. Jennifer, you wrote a book. It's called Hands Up, Don't Shoot. And you've conducted a lot of research for that book. So let's talk about this. Over the years, a number of police departments have tried to implement changes that would make their departments more inclusive, whether specifically seeking out officers of color or mandating that officers actually live in the city that they police. The question, though, is, has that resulted in any significant change in terms of the relationship with minority communities and, most importantly, the violence?
So I had conducted over nearly 200 interviews in Ferguson and Baltimore with protesters and residents within these cities following Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's death. And what I found is that about 25% of the people who I spoke with thought that Black officers treat Black civilians in a courteous and respectful manner compared to whites. However, another 25% believe that Black officers are just as aggressive as white officers, and this in turn, this actually was those who had such beliefs. They actually had encounters with Black officers. So if you'll recall, at the time when Freddie Gray died, the Department of Justice, they conducted their own independent investigation in the Baltimore Police Department, and they concluded that the Baltimore Police Department engaged in a pattern of unconstitutional, racially biased policing. And so, and this has we found this to be the case in other cities as well. And so I argue in my book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, that simply hiring more Black officers in and of itself is not going to be effective in reducing police violence, particularly if there is a culture of policing that encourages the aggressive policing of Black and brown people.
It's something that we've talked about before. In fact, we talked about it yesterday with Nicole Hannah-Jones, reporter for the New York Times, about this very subject with regards to cities or communities that have a large quota of Black officers, like here in New York City, and whether or not you see less violence. And she made the point, much like the one that you're making, Jennifer, which is that you don't see that because it's not the individual, it has to do with the system.
Absolutely. And we err when we just focus on individual police officers, individual people, quote unquote, these bad apples, when the reality is we are talking about a system, a culture of policing that permits the aggressive policing of Black and brown people, which is why we see Black people in particular being over-policed. They are over-sentenced and ultimately over-incarcerated.
So can we talk about the broken windows, I guess, theory or practice that some in New York have suggested help to bring the crime rate down, the focus on nonviolent crimes, cracking down really heavily on those, and the theory being that that means higher level crimes won't happen if you're sort of nipping crime in the bud, if you will. And you can tell me if I define that appropriately. What has been kind of the long-term impact of that type of policy?
So the broken windows paradigm is exactly what you stated, in that there is it's led to order maintenance policing, and it asserts that aggressively cracking down on misdemeanor offenses, minor types of crime, will stem violence. However, that has simply led to a disproportionate number of stops, summons, and arrests of Black and brown people. What much of the research has shown is that the broken windows paradigm has done very little to nothing in terms of actually reducing serious crime. And what it actually has done is it has increased, at least among Black individuals, it has increased levels of unsafety towards feelings of unsafety towards the police. And it's also reduced cooperation with and trust in the police.
Jennifer, you also wrote that, quote, residents are more likely to cooperate when they view the police positively. And I was fascinated by that in particular because again, Anne-Marie and I have spoken about this. We've done a lot of coverage of this particular subject, that when I was a young man, my interactions with police officers were, for the most part, positive. And when I was a kid growing up, I admired police officers. And in fact, when I joined the Army, I wanted to be a military police officer, which is what I ultimately ended up doing. And yet I can see how now as an adult that the system, especially in city departments, city police departments, can bring about some of the things, the issues and the challenges that you write about in your book. The question becomes, what are your thoughts on police who are part of the community, who are, for example, African American, or in some cases, African American women police officers, taking a knee with the protesters, telling the protesters that they understand where they're coming from? Is that one step, or is that, for the protesters, that's not enough, I need the whole system dismantled?
Yeah, so we have seen officers taking a knee, some taking a knee in prayer, some taking a knee in solidarity with the demonstrators, and that act is a step in the right direction in that it does show that some officers that they get it. They understand the extreme outrage, the pain, the hurt, the frustration that so many people have, which has resulted in thousands of people taking to the streets and protesting. And so it certainly is a step in the right direction. However, I will say at the end of the day, protesters are going to want to see changes, concrete changes to policy and practices, concrete changes so that they are not continuously the recipient of aggressive policing and being viewed as suspicious and threatening and ultimately as quote unquote criminal.
All right, Jennifer, really good talking to you. There's like so much more to dig into here, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to revisit it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.